We are at war. If you're a Christian and you believe the Bible is true, I don't think there is going to be much argument about that. What there are some questions about, however, is exactly how we are to go about fighting this war as a church. It's obviously not going to do you much good to know that we are involved in a spiritual war if you do not know how God wants you to engage in battle. One of the reasons it's important to think about spiritual warfare is because there are so many different ideas that come into people's minds when they think about it. If we talk about spiritual warfare with many people, the first thing that is going to come into their minds is the casting out of demons. Spiritual warfare to them equals the casting out of demons. Their basic concept of spiritual warfare is putting a hand on someone's head and shouting out something until that person falls over or something like that. And this is so ingrained in many people's minds that it's hard for them to even imagine that I might say I'm going to talk about spiritual warfare and talk about anything other than that. It used to be when people talked about casting out of demons, they were talking primarily about casting them out of unbelievers. But nowadays, you'll find people are talking more and more about what they think demons do with believers. And there is even a term that people use for that. They call it demonization. And while they may not say that a demon can actually own a believer, they do think that a demon can take over part of a believer's life and force him to sin. And that means when they talk about spiritual warfare, you might hear them talk about things like the demon of lust or the demon of alcohol or the demon of anger. And if people are struggling with a particular sin, someone might say the problem is with a demon and they need to be delivered. I know some people, if someone has a problem, it's almost as if immediately every problem is related to a demon. Your toaster is not working. You have to cast out the demon of the toaster. And this is the way it works even here where I am so often in Africa. We have churches and revival crusades where people go and they're exhorted to have the demon of witchcraft or the demon of jealousy cast out of them. That's what they think of when they think of spiritual warfare. I recently read a letter from a believer in Botswana describing what he sees happening in churches all around him. He says people are told they're bound by demons and all they have to do is go up front and be prayed for. Sometimes Christ won't hardly be mentioned in the sermon, and people get the impression that demons are making them sin, and all they need to do is respond to an altar call or have someone put hands on them, and all will be well. You'll have some churches who talk about holy water, charms, bracelets, which members need to wear in order to protect them from evil. There are other churches where people are told they need to stamp on the ground in order to drive out the devil from their lives. And I know I've had people talk to me about deliverance ministries, and they ask, do you have a deliverance ministry? And what do they mean by that? They're asking, really, do you try to bind demons? And you find there are a lot of people who think there are some sort of special prayers or some sort of special words you can say that will enable you to have power over demons, and that there are special people who have a unique gift of identifying demons and casting them out. And there is, among some, a real kind of fascination with these things. There are books and lectures that have been given on how to get rid of demons, and sometimes even entire seminars and conferences on the subject. And it can get really complex where you'll even find people who are trying to name demons, and they're talking about ancestral spirits and how they think a father can actually pass a demon down to his children, or that someone is being bothered by the spirit of his ancestors. And sometimes they'll talk about things like territorial demons. And the idea there, I guess, is that certain places have certain demons that are in charge, and so they might talk about the demon of Pretoria or the demon of Philadelphia or whatever. And I know that even here where I am, again, we have our own set of things that come up where people talk about spiritual warfare. And I guess for many people, when they think about engaging in spiritual warfare, or they go to church, or they hear about spiritual warfare, pretty much the main idea that comes into their mind are things you can do to get out of curses that you think that other people have put on you. And the reality is that it can get a little confusing because there are demons out there. We believe that. That's what the Bible teaches. And we've all seen crazy stuff, and we've heard stories, and we all probably know people who seem like they're constantly talking about demons and who will go around trying to bind demons and who are worried about witchcraft and curses and magic. And there may be even some of you who have experienced in a firsthand way something that we're talking about, or who have had someone try to cast a demon out of them, and you are given, perhaps you've been given special rituals that you were supposed to go through to get rid of demons in your life. And while there's no way I obviously can answer every single question that has to do with spiritual warfare, what I thought I could do in this series of videos is just try to identify some basic biblical principles for understanding how to think through some of what you might see or might have experienced, or you might hear from people who are telling you about spiritual warfare. Because you see, when you're in these situations and you're confronted with things you don't exactly understand, and you're seeing things you can't quite figure out, one of the very best things you can do is just go back to what you know to be true for sure. And when you try to evaluate what you're seeing or hearing or experiencing, you do that, you make that evaluation in light of what you know to be true without question. And that helps because even if you can't explain everything about what you're seeing, you can have a basic idea of what it is, or at the very least, what it's not. It's kind of like with a complicated problem in math or calculus that you don't understand. You look at the problem, you're sitting there looking at the paper, and you're thinking there's no way that you could ever figure this out. One thing you can do for sure is start with the simple things you do know, like building blocks, you might say, to figuring out the more complicated problem. Because if you don't get those building blocks right, there's no way you'll be able to get the complicated problem right. And so what I want to do is give you, in this series of videos, some simple, basic building blocks for understanding this complicated matter of spiritual warfare.